Good time of day. My name is Ghizlane Benabderrahmane and I am a PhD candidate in English Literature at Bekr Belkaid University in Tlemcen, Algeria. Today, I would like to examine a paradox at the heart of contemporary interactive film. Interactive film presents itself as a medium of agency. It promises participation, co-authorship, and meaningful influence over narrative outcomes. It invites viewers to become decision makers rather than spectators. Yet, when we examine how many of these works actually function, a contradiction emerges. The viewer is repeatedly asked to choose, and the consequences of those choices are often surprisingly limited. The apparent openness of the system frequently conceals a deeper logic of convergence, and I would like to begin exploring that contradiction with something deceptively simple as a bowl of cereal. Not because cereal is important, but because it reveals something important about how interactive systems teach us to understand choice itself. What if the defining feature of interactive film is not that it gives viewers agency, but that it teaches viewers how to accept its limits? That is the question that guides this paper, and in the opening of Bandersnatch's Moments, viewers are invited to choose Stephane Butler's breakfast cereal, Sugar Puffs, or Frosties. The choice appears meaningful. It teaches viewers that their decisions matter, yet both cereals lead to exactly the same narrative state. Nothing changes. The viewer experiences agency, the narrative does not. The distinction between the experience of agency and the structural reality of agency becomes the central concern of my argument. The cereal choice is not a design mistake, it is a lesson that the system will repeat throughout the narrative. The promise is freedom, the outcome is convergence. Before defining any of the central concepts of my arguments, I want to situate what I have in mind within existing scholarship. Questions of agency have occupied interactive digital narrative scholarships for decades. For instance, Ian Bogot's theory of procedural rhetoric demonstrated that interactive systems make arguments through rules and constraints. Aspen Arthur's work on erotic literature similarly showed that participation does not eliminate structure. More recently, Anna Marie Rusk and Mad Harris' analysis of Bandersnatch demonstrated that despite the apparent complexity, the work offers a surprisingly restrictive form of agency. My argument builds on these insights. However, it asks a different question. Rather than asking what constraints means, I ask what constraints do. More specifically, what kind of relationship to choice is produced when interactive systems repeatedly normalize, redirect, and correct deviation? To answer this question, I introduce the concept of disciplinary interactivity. I define disciplinary interactivity as the use of interactive choice architectures that stimulate the agency while structurally directing viewers towards predetermined outcomes through mechanisms of normalization, correction, and convergence. Ultimately, I will argue that the disciplinary interactivity operates on two levels: the management of choices and the management of knowledge. This two-level distinction will become particularly important in the final case study. To develop this argument, I draw open four theoretical traditions, starting by Marie-Laure Ryan, who helped distinguish between the feeling of agency and genuine structural agency. Hartmut Quentis' system, process, and product model helped locate that distinction within the interactive narrative architecture. Then we have Alexander Galloway and Wendy Chun, who explained how digital systems organize behavior through participation rather than prohibition. And Michel Foucault provides the concepts of normalization, correction, and discipline that frame my analysis. These scholars allow us to move beyond the question of whether users choose and toward the question of how systems organize the conditions under which those choices become meaningful. To examine this systematically, I developed something I would like to call choice mapping. It's a methodology that will help support classify all of these situations. Rather than focusing on themes or characters, choice mapping focuses on structure. Specifically, it asks what happens after a choice is made. Does the narrative genuinely diverge? Or does it return to a predetermined path? Using this method, I classify decisions nodes into 5 categories. We have genuine branch, false branch, dead end, and forced path, and of course, a delayed banishment. These categories allow us to identify where agency expands and where it is foreclosed. With that framework established, I can now turn into the first case of study, which is Black Mirror Bandersnatch. And Bandersnatch occupies a unique position within interactive media scholarship because it is simultaneously a commercial phenomena and one of the most extensively analyzed examples of contemporary interactive films. Netflix reported approximately 250 narrative segments and 5 major endings. At first glance, this architecture appears to offer extraordinary narrative openness. However, existing scholarship already encourages us to approach that impression with caution. Rusk and Hera's analysis demonstrated that despite its apparent complexity, Bandersnatch offers a surprisingly restrictive form of agency. And my analysis built on that observation, but asks a different question. Rather than asking whether agency is limited, I ask how that limitation operates. Applying the choice mapping methodology reveals 3 recurring mechanisms. Despite the apparent multiplicity of the available routes, most narrative journeys ultimately arrive at a small number of outcomes centered on Stefan's psychological collapse, violence, imprisonment, or death. Ryan's distinction between phenomenological and structural agency becomes important here, and the viewer experiences freedom. The narrative architecture repeatedly limits what that freedom can become. The second mechanism is the narrative reset. The Turkey sequence provides the clearest example. For a brief moment, Stefan appears to escape the trajectory preferred by the system, yet almost immediately the narrative intervenes and redirects him towards an earlier decision point. From a Foucauldian perspective, this is a process of normalization. The deviation is not punished, it is corrected. The third mechanism is the false branch. The serial choice is one example. The music selection on the bus is another. Different options are presented. Participation is maintained, yet the resultant narrative state remains functionally identical. From Ryan's perspective, these nodes fail to generate genuine agency. From 𝗁𝘁𝗁's perspective, they reveal the gap between apparent complexity of the system and the experience ultimately delivered. These mechanisms reveal a recurring pattern. Bandersnatch does not eliminate agency, it manages agency, and this is where Galloway and Chun become particularly useful. Galloway argues that digital systems exercise power through modulation rather than prohibition, and Chun similarly demonstrates that freedom and control frequently operate together rather than in opposition. Bandersnatch exemplifies this paradox, and it offers freedom. It offers a freedom where boundaries have already been designed. At this point, I want to consider something equally important: the film's self-awareness. Bandersnatch openly reflects open control. As the narrative progresses, Stefan increasingly suspects that his actions are being directed by an external force. The viewer occupies a similar position. We make choices, yet those choices exist only within the boundaries established by the system. This creates a remarkable convergence between form and content. The story explores the loss of agency. Its structure repeatedly limits agency. One might argue that this self-awareness exempts the film from critique. I would argue the opposite. Awareness does not dissolve structure. Knowing that the system is managing your choices does not prevent it from managing them. As Vadim observes, Bandersnatch continually discusses free will while simultaneously demonstrating its limits. In Chom's terms, autonomy becomes the mechanism through which control operates. The significance of Bandersnatch therefore extends beyond interactive cinema. It becomes a case study in how contemporary digital systems increasingly govern through participation rather than prohibition. My second case of study approaches the same problem from a different direction. Late Shift contains approximately 150 decision points and 7 genuinely distinct endings. Compared to Bandersnatch, the narrative architecture appears considerably more open. And the issue here is not primarily convergence, the issue is time. The decision is governed by a countdown timer. The viewers often have only few seconds to respond, and Ryan's theory becomes useful once again. For Ryan, agency requires more than selection. It requires deliberation. The timer systematically disturbs that condition. The viewer is no longer encouraged to reflect. The viewer is encouraged to react. Choice becomes urgency, participation becomes impulse, and this is where Galloway's concept of modulation becomes particularly illuminating. The system does not prohibit action, it structures the conditions under which action becomes possible. The viewer remains free, yet the conditions of freedom have already been engineered. From a Foucauldian perspective, the timer functions as a disciplinary mechanism because it produces self-regulation. No authority figure appears, yet viewers modify their behavior in response to the countdown. The pressure becomes internalized. Late Shift, therefore, demonstrates that disciplinary interactivity can emerge even within systems that offer greater narrative divergence. The issue is not simply where choices lead. The issue is how choices are structured, and an additional dimension emerges when we consider the film's original exhibition context. Until Bandersnatch, Late Shift was initially experienced collectively. Audience voted together in cinemas. The timer therefore produced not only temporal pressure but also social pressure. The possibility of making the wrong choice became publicly visible. This is what I call the social panopticon. The audience itself becomes part of the disciplinary apparatus. Participation remains genuine, yet participation simultaneously becomes the mechanism through which conformity is produced. Bandersnatch and Late Shift demonstrate how disciplinary interactivity can operate through narrative architecture, temporal architecture, and social architecture. However, both remain commercial fiction. To fully test the framework, I have a final case of study, Universe Within. So I deliberately selected this film because it presents the strongest challenge to my argument. Unlike Bandersnatch, it rarely relies on false branches. Unlike Late Shift, it does not discipline through urgency. Users can explore different cities, communities, and perspectives. These choices genuinely matter. A viewer following one pathway encounters experiences unavailable through another. And from Ryan's perspective, many of these choices produce genuine narrative agency. Similarly, Quantis's model reveals a substantially different relationship between system and product. The process does not funnel users toward a narrow range of experiences. The product varies significantly depending upon the route selected, and at first glance, therefore, the film appears to contradict the disciplinary interactivity thesis. And that is precisely why it is important. A useful theory should survive contact with its strongest counterexamples. When I applied the framework to this film, I discovered that disciplinary interactivity had not disappeared. Instead, it was operating on a different level, and this observation led me to the paper's central theoretical refinement. Disciplinary interactivity can operate at two levels. The first is the node level, and the This concerns individual decisions. Where does divergence occur? Where is it corrected? And where does the user genuinely influence the narrative trajectory? Bandersnatch and late shift operate primarily at this level. The second is epistemic level. This concerns the distribution of knowledge within the work. What conclusions does the structure ultimately ensure the user receives, regardless of the paths taken? High rise is relatively open at the node level, but it remains considerably more structured at the epistemic level. Regardless whether users explore Mumbai, Toronto, or another pathway, the documentary's central thesis remains remarkably stable. Different routes, different experiences. This observation becomes clear through Kate Nash's distinction between voice as social participation and voice as authorship. High-rise genuinely expands participation. Users possesses meaningful navigational freedom, yet authorship remains largely intact. The documentary's core argument survives regardless of the route, and this distinction, I would argue, represents the paper's most significant contribution. It allows us to explain not only where disciplinary interactivity appears, but also how it changes across different forms of interactive media. Having established this distinction between node level and epistemic level discipline, I now want to consider the broader implications of the argument. At this point, an important question emerges. Why do many interactive systems repeatedly converge? The answer I propose is structural rather than intentional. This is not an argument about deceptive authors or flawed designs. The pattern identified in this study emerged from conditions under which contemporary interactive media are produced. Commercial interactive narratives operate within constraints of budget, production, coherence, and as narrative complexity increases, maintaining genuinely divergent pathways becomes increasingly difficult. From this perspective, some degree of convergence may be unavoidable. This observation leads directly to one of the strongest objections of my argument. Is all convergence disciplinary? I would argue that it is not. Every narrative requires some form of closure. Stories end, characters complete arcs, themes require resolution. Without convergence, narrative coherence becomes difficult to sustain. What I call disciplinary convergence occurs before narrative closure becomes necessary. It appears when divergence is repeatedly corrected before the consequences can meaningfully unfold. It appears when false branches substitute for genuine alternatives, and appears when participation is encouraged while outcomes remain tightly managed. The issue is how they converge. This distinction between necessary convergence and disciplinary convergence is essential because it prevents the argument from becoming a critique of narrative form itself. Stories require endings, and disciplinary systems require correction, and the two should not be confused. The second objection emerged from Ryan's phenomenological approach to agency. One might argue that even if choices do not fundamentally transform the narrative world, viewers still experience those choices as meaningful. The emotional investment remains real, the engagement remains real, and the pleasure remains real. Perhaps then the feeling of agency is what ultimately matters. This objection deserves serious consideration, and in many aspects I agree with it. The experience of agency is real. The viewer who feels invested in Bandersnatch or late shift is not mistaken. However, as Chan reminds us, freedom itself cannot become a mechanism of regulation. The disciplinary critique, therefore, operates at a different level. It is not a claim about psychology, it is a claim about structure. The question is not whether viewers feel agency. The question is how systems organize the condition under which agency can be exercised. And once we begin asking that question, the recurring patterns identified across the case studies become difficult to ignore. And this brings me directly to the theme of this conference, the yet to be known. I would like to suggest that This theme provides a particularly useful lens through which to understand the findings of this paper, because what is repeatedly foreclosed within those systems is not simply narrative divergence. The narrative reset limits it, the timer limits it, and the epistemic convergence limits it. What these mechanisms manage is precisely the yet to be known. The future appears open and not only within carefully designed boundaries. This observation returns us to Galloway's account of algorithmic culture. Digital systems increasingly operate through modulation rather than prohibition. Possibilities are not eliminated outright, and they are organized, structured, and managed. The unknown remains present, and it becomes a controlled known. At this point, a final question emerges. If disciplinary interactivity identifies a problem, what would a genuine alternative look like? Ryan provides a starting point. Genuine agency requires a production of narrative possibilities that meaningfully alter the world being experienced. And the challenge is therefore not simply to increase the number of available choices, it is to increase the consequences of those choices. Interactive digital narrative scholarships already provides examples of this possibility. Works such as Facade demonstrate that more adaptive and emergent narrative systems can be built. The importance of such projects is not merely technological. They demonstrate that disciplinary convergence is not inevitable. Alternative models already exist, and the limitations identified throughout the paper are therefore not purely technical. They are also institutional, economic, and cultural. This realization allows us to reframe the problem. The question is no longer whether genuine agency is possible. The question is why systems capable of supporting greater agency remain relatively uncommon within commercial interactive media. And I would like to conclude by returning to the image with which I began, a bowl of cereal. At first glance, it appears insignificant, a trivial decision, a harmless choice, yet that choice performs an important lesson. It teaches viewers how to understand participation, it teaches viewers how to understand agency, and perhaps most importantly, it teaches viewers how to understand the future. And the cereal choice tells us that the future is open, and the analysis I had presented today suggests something more complicated. The future may appear open while remaining carefully structured. The future may appear uncertain while remaining largely predetermined. And the future may invite participation while simultaneously organizing the conditions under which participation occurs. And the challenge for interactive media, therefore, is not simply to provide more choices. It is to create spaces in which choices genuinely matter, spaces in which divergence is not immediately corrected, spaces in which uncertainty is not merely stimulated, spaces in which the yet to be known can genuinely emerge. Because if interactive media are to fulfill their most ambitious promise, they must do more than manage possibility. They must create possibility, and they must allow users to encounter outcomes that exceed the system's prior imagination, and they must remain open to futures that neither designer nor participants can fully predict in advance. Only then can interactive media move beyond the simulation of agency toward its realization, and only then can the cereal become something more than the same cereal. Or perhaps, more accurately, only then can the future become something other than the same future. Thank you so much for your attendance.